15 years later, a millionaire finds a clue that could lead to his lost son. You won't believe it. The pristine snow-covered mountain road stretched endlessly before John's luxury SUV as he navigated the treacherous curves with his 7-year-old son Charlie dozing in the back seat. The boy clutched his most precious possession, a silver pendant bearing their family crest, recent gift from his father that rarely left his neck. John glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with love for his only child, all he had left after his wife's passing 2 years ago. The forecast had warned of an approaching blizzard, but John, a successful real estate mogul, was determined to reach his sister's mountain cabin. He'd promised Charlie they wouldn't miss another family gathering, not after spending so many holidays alone in their expansive but empty mansion. The radio crackled with static as they climbed higher into the mountains, the snow falling heavier with each passing minute. "Daddy, are we almost there?" Charlie's sleepy voice drifted from the back seat. "Just a little longer, buddy," John replied, squinting through the increasingly dense snowfall. But his voice was suddenly cut short by a sharp gasp as their vehicle hit a patch of black ice. John's experienced hands gripped the wheel, but the SUV spun wildly, careening toward the guardrail. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle broke through the barrier, rolling down the steep embankment. The last thing John heard was Charlie's terrified scream before everything went black. When consciousness returned, it came in waves of searing pain. Through blurred vision, John could make out the sterile white of a hospital room. His sister Emily's tear-stained face came into focus. "Charlie!" The name escaped his lips in a hoarse whisper. Emily's face crumpled. "They haven't found him, John. You've been unconscious for 2 weeks. The search teams, they've looked everywhere." The truth struck him like a physical blow. While he lay trapped in unconsciousness, his precious son had vanished into the wilderness. Search and rescue teams combed the area for months, but the brutal winter storm had erased all traces. The mysterious disappearance captured national headlines. The missing son of a millionaire vanished without a trace in a snowstorm. What no one knew was that while John lay unconscious, Charlie had managed to crawl from the wreckage, disoriented and terrified. The boy wandered through the blinding snow until his frozen legs could carry him no further. As hypothermia set in, salvation appeared in the form of an elderly couple's pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the wide-out conditions like a beacon of hope. Mrs. Rose, a retired nurse, and her husband Mr. Tom had been returning from their weekly supply run when they spotted what they first thought was a wounded animal by the roadside. Instead, they found a nearly frozen child who could barely remember his own name, much less where he came from. With phone lines down and roads rapidly becoming impassable, they took the boy to their remote cabin, determined to save his life. Days turned into weeks as Charlie recovered, his memories fragmented by trauma. The elderly couple's attempts to contact authorities were thwarted by the region's worst winter in decades. When spring finally arrived, they had grown attached to the quiet, thoughtful child who believed himself orphaned. Having lost their own son years ago, they convinced themselves that keeping Charlie was a blessing meant to be. They moved across the country that summer, telling neighbors their grandson had come to live with them. Charlie, now calling himself Daniel, grew into their simple life, the memories of his past fading like old photographs left in the sun. Back in the city, John's grief transformed into an obsession. He poured his fortune into the search, hired private investigators, and plastered Charlie's face across every media outlet. Yet each lead ran cold, each potential sighting ended in disappointment. The mysterious disappearance that shook the wealthy circles of society remained unsolved, becoming one of those tragic stories people whispered about at social gatherings. As months stretched into years, John's once vibrant spirit dimmed. His business empire ran on autopilot while he devoted himself to following the faintest hints of his son's fate. The only thing that kept him going was the unshakable feeling that somewhere, somehow, Charlie was still alive. What he couldn't know was that every night, in a modest home hundreds of miles away, a young boy touched a silver pendant he couldn't remember receiving, wondering why it felt so important to never take it off. 15 years after the tragic accident, John sat in his penthouse office, staring at the wall of evidence that had consumed his life. Hundreds of photos, newspaper clippings, and investigation reports covered every inch of space. Each morning, his personal assistant would bring new leads from private investigators scattered across the country, and each evening, John would add another dead end to his wall of heartbreak. The once ambitious real estate mogul had transformed his empire into a network dedicated to finding his son. Every hotel he owned displayed Charlie's age-progressed photos in their lobbies. Every development project included a command center where teams analyzed reported sightings. His sister Emily had begged him to seek therapy, to find peace, but John knew that somewhere out there, his son was alive. Mr. John, his assistant Sarah interrupted his thoughts. The new detective from the mountain region is here. The detective brought familiar news, another false lead, another disappointment. But this time, something different caught John's attention. We found an interesting pattern, the detective explained, spreading out a map. Every Christmas for the past 15 years, someone has been leaving a silver coin at the accident site. Always the same type, always at midnight. Meanwhile, in a small farming community hundreds of miles away, Daniel, once known as Charlie, helped Mr. Tom repair their old tractor. At 22, he had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's determined eyes and his mother's gentle smile, though he remembered neither parent. The silver pendant still hung around his neck, its origins a mystery that sometimes haunted his dreams. "You're quieter than usual today, son," Mr. Tom observed, wiping grease from his weathered hands. Daniel touched the pendant absently. "I had that dream again, about the snow and the screaming. Mrs. Rose says I should try to remember, but the past is the past." Mr. Tom interrupted quickly, his voice carrying an edge of worry. "What matters is the life we've built here." But lately, that life had begun to feel like a beautiful photograph with blurred edges. Daniel's questions about his past grew more frequent, sparked by fragments of memories that surfaced in his dreams. Mrs. Rose had started avoiding his questions, her usual warmth clouded by guilt that Daniel couldn't understand. One evening, while helping Mrs. Rose with dinner, Daniel discovered an old newspaper clipping tucked inside her recipe book. The headline caught his eye: "Millionaire's Missing Son. 15 Years of Heartbreak." The photo of the missing boy made his heart stop. It was like looking in a mirror from the past. Before he could read more, Mrs. Rose snatched the article away, her hands trembling. "I saved it because the story reminded me of how blessed we were to find you," she stammered. That night, Daniel lay awake, the weight of unspoken truths pressing against his chest. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about missing children from 15 years ago. As he scrolled through countless stories, one face made him freeze. A school photo of a 7-year-old boy wearing a silver pendant identical to his own. In his Manhattan office, John prepared for another Christmas pilgrimage to the accident site. Every year, he would stand in the snow, replaying that fateful night, searching for answers in the silence. This year, however, something felt different. The detective's revelation about the silver coins gnawed at his mind. John had given Charlie a silver coin collection for his 7th birthday, teaching him about the importance of tradition and family legacy. The pendant Charlie wore was designed to hold one special coin, a piece from the year of his birth. Determination sparked in John's eyes for the first time in years. He would wait at the accident site this Christmas Eve, hidden from view, to discover who had been leaving these annual tributes. Something deep in his soul told him this might be his last chance to uncover the truth. As snow began to fall outside his window, Daniel stared at his computer screen, his world shifting on its axis. The article detailed how John had never stopped searching for his son, how he dedicated his life and fortune to solving the mystery that tore his family apart. The missing boy's photo showed him wearing a pendant, the same pendant that now felt impossibly heavy against Daniel's chest. Mrs. Rose found him still at his computer the next morning, his eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. When she saw the article on his screen, she sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we were doing the right thing," she whispered. "You were so scared, so confused. We tried to find your family, but the storms. And then we fell in love with you, and the thought of losing you." Daniel held her trembling hands, understanding flowing between them. "You saved my life," he said softly. But now I need to know the truth about who I am. As Christmas approached, two men prepared for journeys that would change their lives forever. John packed his car with warm clothes and surveillance equipment, determined to solve the mystery of the silver coins. Daniel, with Mrs. Rose's tearful blessing, planned his own trip to the mountains, carrying with him the coin he'd been leaving at the accident site every year. A ritual he'd performed since finding it inside his pendant as a teenager, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. Neither knew that this Christmas, the secrets buried in the snow would finally come to light. The autumn wind whistled through the mountain pass as John parked his car near the accident site. 15 years of searching had led him back here countless times, but tonight felt different. The detective's discovery about the mysterious silver coins left at the memorial marker had ignited a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. As dusk settled over the mountains, headlights appeared in the distance. John watched from his concealed position as a pickup truck parked alongside the road. A young man emerged, tall and lean, moving with careful steps along the rocky ground. Even from a distance, something about his posture made John's heart race. The stranger approached the memorial marker John had placed years ago. In the fading light, a silver pendant glinted against his dark coat. John watched, transfixed, as the young man knelt and removed something from his pocket. A silver coin identical to the ones from Charlie's collection. Unable to contain himself, John stepped from his hiding place. "You're the one," he called out, his voice carrying on the mountain air. "You've been leaving the coins here all these years." The young man startled, nearly dropping the coin. When he turned, John saw his face clearly in the last rays of sunlight. A familiar scar traced his hairline, a mark John had memorized from thousands of missing person posters. "I don't know why I come," the young man said, his voice uncertain. "Something draws me here, like a memory I can't quite reach." John stepped closer, trembling. "That pendant you're wearing, may I see it?" Daniel, for it was him, instinctively clutched the silver pendant. "It's all I have from before," he admitted. "Mrs. Rose says they found me wearing it." "Mrs. Rose?" John's voice cracked. "The woman who raised me. She and her husband found me during a terrible storm, nearly frozen." Daniel's eyes grew distant. "They saved my life." John fought to keep his composure. "The pendant, does it open? Does it hold a silver coin from the year you were born?" Daniel's eyes widened. "How could you know that?" "Because I gave it to my son, Charlie, for his 7th birthday." John pulled out his wallet with shaking hands, retrieving a worn photograph. "The last time I saw him was right here, 15 years ago, during the worst blizzard this mountain had ever seen." Daniel stared at the photo, a smiling boy wearing his pendant, sitting on the lap of a younger version of the man before him. His knees weakened, and he grabbed the memorial marker for support. "I've been having dreams," Daniel whispered, "about a crash, about screaming in the snow. Mrs. Rose always said they were just nightmares, but—" "You have a scar," John said softly, "right along your hairline. Charlie got it when he was 5, climbing a tree in our backyard. I carried him to the emergency room myself." Daniel's hand unconsciously touched the scar. Memories began flooding back, fragments of a life he'd thought lost forever. A grand piano in a marble-floored foyer, a woman's gentle laugh, a father's strong hands teaching him to ride a bike. All these years, Daniel breathed. "I felt like I was missing pieces of myself. Mrs. Rose and Mr. Tom are wonderful people, but there was always something. They saved you," John completed, understanding flooding his heart. "When I couldn't." The mountain air grew colder around them as father and son stood in loaded silence. Daniel pulled out his phone, hands shaking as he Googled, "Charlie missing son millionaire." Hundreds of articles appeared, showing his own face at different ages, progressed by computer software that had somehow perfectly predicted his current appearance. "You never stopped looking," Daniel said, tears glistening in his eyes. "Not for a single day," John replied, taking a cautious step forward. "Every lead, every possible sighting. I knew in my heart you were alive somewhere." Daniel's world tilted on its axis as 15 years of questions suddenly found their answers. The strange comfort he felt in luxury hotels, so different from his simple life with the Roses. his inexplicable knowledge of fine wines and classical music, the way his heart pulled him to this spot each year with the silver coin he'd found inside his pendant. "I have a father," Daniel whispered, the words foreign on his tongue. Then, louder, testing the word that had lived in his dreams, "Dad?" John crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, enveloping his son in an embrace that had waited 15 years. They stood there as the last light faded from the sky, both weeping, as a decade and a half of loss and longing poured out between them. When they finally separated, Daniel wiped his eyes. "Mrs. Rose and Mr. Tom, they need to know I'm safe. They've been carrying this secret, this guilt, for so long." John nodded, understanding the complex emotions at play. "We'll go together. They're your family too. They gave you a life when I couldn't be there. This isn't about replacing anyone. It's about completing the puzzle of who you are." As they walked to their vehicles, Daniel stopped suddenly. "Wait," he said, returning to the memorial marker. He placed the silver coin he'd brought, then reached into his pendant and removed another, the original coin his father had given him 15 years ago. He placed them side by side. "No more solitary visits," he said, rejoining his father. "From now on, we face everything together." They drove down the mountain in convoy, the autumn wind sweeping leaves around their vehicles like nature's celebration. A father and son, lost to each other for so long, had finally found their way home. The drive to the Rose family farm seemed eternal. John followed Daniel's pickup truck through the snowy darkness, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every few minutes, he checked his rearview mirror, terrified that his son's taillights would disappear like a mirage. When they finally arrived, Mrs. Rose was waiting on the porch, her worried face illuminated by the Christmas lights strung along the railing. The moment she saw Daniel's expression, she knew. Her hand flew to her mouth as John emerged from his car. "You're his father," she whispered, recognition dawning in her eyes. "I've seen your face so many times in the papers." Mr. Tom appeared behind his wife, his weathered face a mask of complex emotions. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "This isn't a conversation for the cold." In the Rose's warm kitchen, over cups of Mrs. Rose's trembling-handed coffee, the full story emerged. The elderly couple described finding Daniel, Charlie, in the snow, his clothes frozen stiff, barely conscious. They shared how the winter storms had isolated their region for weeks, phone lines down, roads impassable. "By the time we could reach anyone," Mrs. Rose explained, tears streaming down her face, "he'd forgotten so much. The trauma," the doctors said. He'd wake up screaming about the snow, but couldn't remember his name, his family. "We tried calling hospitals," Mr. Tom added, his voice rough with emotion, "but no one could tell us about any accidents. The storm had caused so much chaos." John listened, his heart torn between gratitude for their care of his son and anguish for the years lost. "You saved his life," he acknowledged softly. "But why? Why didn't you look harder for his family once spring came?" The silence that followed was heavy with guilt. Mrs. Rose pulled out a wooden box, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside lay newspaper clippings about the missing son of a millionaire, photographs of search parties, and headlines about the unprecedented reward offered for information. "We saw the stories," she admitted, "but by then, we'd fallen in love with him. The thought of losing him—" She broke down, unable to continue. Daniel, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stood. "I need some air," he announced, stepping onto the porch. John watched him go, understanding the overwhelming weight of these revelations. Mr. Tom cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know," he said, retrieving a small box from a high shelf. Inside was a collection of childhood drawings, school reports, and photographs, a careful documentation of Daniel's life. "We kept everything, hoping someday—" John's hands trembled as he sifted through the artifacts of his son's lost years. Report cards praised Daniel's intelligence and kindness. Photos showed him growing from a serious-eyed child into a confident young man. Each item was a piece of the puzzle he'd been desperately trying to solve for 15 years. Outside, Daniel stared into the snowy darkness, touching the pendant that had become both comfort and catalyst. John joined him, maintaining a respectful distance. "I know this is overwhelming," John said softly. "I understand if you need time." Daniel turned, his eyes glistening. "All my life, I've had these fragments, memories that didn't make sense. A Christmas tree touching a ceiling so high I couldn't see the top. A woman's voice singing me to sleep. Your voice reading stories. Your mother," John whispered. "She sang to you every night. I have another family," Daniel continued. "A whole life I can't remember. But the roses, they're my family too. They chose me, protected me, loved me." John nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions his son faced. "We can take a DNA test," he offered. "Not because I have any doubts, but to give you the certainty you deserve." The next week passed in a blur of medical appointments and careful conversations. The Roses insisted John stay in their guest room, creating an unusual family dynamic as they all navigated their new reality. Each meal became an opportunity for sharing stories, filling in the gaps of 15 lost years. Mrs. Rose shared photos of Daniel's first fishing trip with Mr. Tom. John countered with stories of Charlie's early years, his love for horses, his mother's death. Slowly, the parallel lives began to merge into a single narrative. When the DNA results arrived, no one was surprised by the confirmation, but seeing the scientific proof affected Daniel deeply. He spent hours in his room, emerging with reddened eyes and a new resolve. "I want to know everything," he announced at dinner that evening. "About my mother, about our life before. But I don't want to lose this life either." He looked at the Roses, then at John. "Is it possible to have both?" John reached across the table, squeezing his son's hand. "Of course it is. Family isn't about replacing people. It's about adding more love to your life." Mrs. Rose wiped her eyes with her apron. "We've had you all to ourselves for 15 years, she said softly. "It's time to share." Mr. Tom cleared his throat gruffly. "Your father's welcome here anytime," he declared. "This is the only way we'll have any peace about what we did." Daniel stood suddenly, pulling both John and Mrs. Rose into an embrace. Mr. Tom joined them, completing the circle. In that moment, they weren't a wealthy businessman, a pair of elderly farmers, and a lost-and-found son. They were simply a family, bound together by love, forgiveness, and the miracle of second chances. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Daniel finally opened the box of childhood memories Mr. Tom had preserved. Together with John, he began the journey of reconciling his two lives, not choosing between them, but weaving them together into something stronger and more beautiful than either could be alone. Spring came early to the mountain valley, melting away the last traces of winter snow. John had extended his stay at the local inn indefinitely, unwilling to miss a single moment of rebuilding his relationship with Daniel. Each morning brought new discoveries, new connections, and new understanding between father and son. In the bright April sunshine, Daniel taught his father the intricacies of farm life. John's expensive suits were replaced by worn jeans and work boots as he learned to mend fences, feed livestock, and repair tractors alongside Mr. Tom. His soft hands grew calloused, but his heart grew fuller with each passing day. "You're holding that wrench all wrong," Daniel laughed one afternoon, watching his father struggle with the tractor's engine. "Here, let me show you." As their hands touched during the demonstration, both men felt the weight of years melting away, replaced by the simple joy of father-son bonding. Mrs. Rose watched from her kitchen window, wiping happy tears as she prepared lunch for her expanded family. The sight of the three men working together, their laughter carrying across the fields, healed something deep in her soul that had been wounded by 15 years of secrecy. One evening, as they sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sunset, Daniel turned to his father. "Tell me about my mother," he requested softly. "I have these fragments of memories, the scent of vanilla, a laugh like music, but I can't piece them together." John's eyes misted as he pulled out his wallet, retrieving a worn photograph. "Her name was Elizabeth," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "She was a concert pianist. That's why we had that enormous Christmas tree you remember. Our living room had cathedral ceilings to accommodate her grand piano." Daniel traced his mother's face in the photograph, recognizing her smile as his own. "She used to sing to me," he whispered, the memory surfacing like a bubble from deep water. Every night, John confirmed, she said her music would always connect us, no matter where life took us. He paused, gathering strength. She would be so proud of the man you've become, Daniel. Or Charlie. Which would you prefer I call you? Daniel considered the question that had been weighing on him. Daniel Charles, he decided. To honor both lives that made me who I am. As spring progressed, John found himself drawn into the rhythm of country life. He conducted business via video calls from the farm's sunny kitchen, much to Mrs. Rose's amusement. His corporate board was shocked to see their impeccable CEO in flannel shirts, but none could deny the positive change in him. The Roses shared Daniel's childhood mementos with John, each item a precious glimpse into the years he'd missed. School awards, handmade Mother's Day cards, and photographs of fishing trips filled the gaps in his heart. In return, John shared videos of Charlie's early years, letting Daniel reconnect with the mother he'd lost twice. One warm evening, Mr. Tom found John alone in the barn, examining an old saddle. Daniel mentioned you used to have horses, the older man said, settling onto a hay bale. Elizabeth loved riding, John replied. We had a stable full of horses before everything changed. Mr. Tom nodded thoughtfully. There's a nice property for sale just down the road. Good pasture land, solid barn. Might be nice to have horses again. John looked at him in surprise. You wouldn't mind if I stayed in the area? Mind? Mr. Tom chuckled. Son, this valley's big enough for all of us to be family. The next day, John made an offer on the property. By summer's end, a new house stood on the land, its wraparound porch offering views of both the Rose Farm and the mountain where fate had torn his family apart and, ultimately, brought them back together. Daniel split his time between both homes, helping his father establish a small horse breeding operation while maintaining his responsibilities at the Rose Farm. The sound of hoofbeats across the pasture mingled with the mooing of dairy cows, creating a symphony that represented his beautifully blended life. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after their reunion, both families gathered in John's new home. Mrs. Rose's traditional farm-style cooking shared the table with gourmet dishes prepared by John's personal chef, who had become a permanent fixture in the household. The enormous Christmas tree touched the cathedral ceiling, just as Daniel remembered from his early childhood. After dinner, Daniel excused himself briefly, returning with 4 small boxes. I had something made for each of you, he said, distributing the packages. Inside each box was a silver pendant, identical to the one he still wore. Each contained a coin for John, the year of Daniel's birth. For the Roses, the year they became his second family. And for Daniel himself, a new coin marking the year of reunion. So we're all connected, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. By love, by time, by forgiveness. Mrs. Rose embraced him tearfully while Mr. Tom cleared his throat repeatedly, blinking rapidly. John simply held his pendant, understanding the profound symbolism of his son's gesture. Later that night, after the Roses had returned home, Daniel and John stood on the porch, watching snow begin to fall. I used to hate the snow, Daniel admitted. It brought back fragments of terror I couldn't understand. But now, he held out his hand, catching a snowflake. Now it reminds me that sometimes we have to get lost to be found. John wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. Your mother used to say that love is like music. It can't be destroyed, only transformed. She was right. Everything we lost, everything the Roses gained, it all became part of a greater symphony. Daniel leaned into his father's embrace, finally completely at peace with both his past and his present. Above them, the stars shone brightly through breaks in the clouds, witnessing a miracle of love that had transcended time, trauma, and loss to create something even more beautiful than what had been lost. Don't miss this heartfelt story of love, loss, and second chances.